Contact us at Skills World Live. We want to hear from you. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter at Skills World Live, at Tom Buick. Use the hashtag Skills World Live. Call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111.
On tonight's programme, we're looking at what just went wrong during the summer exam season. Of course, it's worth reminding ourselves that no actual exams took place anywhere across the United Kingdom. When the pandemic hit in March, ministers and qualifications regulators were put in a very unique and challenging position. In England, we now know that Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, had three options put to him by the exams watchdog Ofqual. They included delaying the exams, adapting the qualifications, perhaps by issuing a teacher's certificate, or the now fabled route of centre-assessed and calculated grades. All four nations went for a mixture of centre-assessed grades combined with the different forms of statistical moderation. Indeed, we spent the very first episode of the programme in the last series looking at all the challenges in academic research on the merits and pitfalls of tutor-predicted grades. Ministers in the Department for Education and officials at Ofqual were explicitly warned by the Education Select Committee in a report back in June that the approach adopted could cause some serious issues. And it has subsequently come to light that Sir John Coles, the school's academy chain boss and former Director General at the Department for Education, who wrote to Gavin Williamson a month before A-Level Results Day, explicitly warning about the effect of Ofqual's algorithm on disadvantaged groups. Of course, we all now know what happened next. A portent of things to come first emerged in Scotland, when Education Minister John Sweeney was forced to apologise to students and the Scottish Parliament for thousands of results being downgraded. He reversed the Scottish Qualification Authority's model and ordered the reissuing of results based purely on centre-assessed grades. England, Wales and Northern Ireland would follow suit within days, but not until after a series of conflicting communications and behind-the-scenes disagreements between ministers and their independent regulator. Earlier on, I caught up with the man now tasked with finding out what went wrong this summer and how public confidence can be restored in time for next year's exams. I'm talking about Robert Halfon, the MP for Harlow and the chair of the key House of Commons Cross-Party Scrutiny Committee. I asked him earlier directly what he thought had gone wrong.
Well, there is unfortunately a lot of things that went wrong, and there are many burnt fingers in this algorithm pie that was baked. Clearly, at the beginning, there were disagreements between Ofqual and the government whether or not there should be exams, a grading system, or the algorithm. I think that Ofqual went ahead a bit like the Charge of the Light Brigade with the algorithm, even ignoring offers of advice from the Royal Statistical Society and respected people like Sir John Coles. Ofqual recognised that there would be anomalies. I'm not quite clear why Ofqual didn't do their own mock test, a widespread mock test, in essence a dummy run of all the grades that were produced by teachers in early June to see what the anomalies were and whether or not they could be ironed out in time for results day. I thought that the communications from Ofqual was incredibly poor. They hid themselves away in an attic during the crises. They refused to speak to the media. Unacceptable. There should be an accountable body. They refused to reassure parents, teachers. All the chair of Ofqual said when he came to my committee was, well, that was the PR advice. That's given that they are accountable, paid for by the taxpayer, they have 11 communications officers. That shouldn't have happened. So we've got, and then of course we have the BTEC problem, because Ofqual seemed to sort of regard that as an afterthought. Passing mention in the chairman's statement on the Monday of the U-turn in August, and we know that 450,000 students were affected. I would just add a huge thank you to you, Tom, the awarding bodies, the exam officers, for the unbelievable work that they had to do to kind of stop the domino effect that in essence happened to BTECs because of the exam grading fiasco.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure those AOs that I work with will very much appreciate those comments from the chair of the Education Select Committee. But, Robert, from what you're saying, I mean, really, you're laying the blame, as it were. I'm not saying you calling it blame, but, you're saying that actually all these problems are really at Ofqual's door. I mean, do you not think there's any responsibility shared with the Department for Education as well, after all, set the policy that put the 2 ministerial mandates out there that Ofqual had to follow? And given that from your committee we know that the chair, Roger Taylor, said that 3 options were put to Gavin Williamson back in, I think it was in March, of which calculated results was the least desirable. Do you not think there's some questions still to be answered around that whole aspect of what happened?
Absolutely. So I was very clear to you in the beginning. As I said that the Department of Education and Ofqual have a lot to answer in terms of what went on. And I said it, I used the metaphor many fingers in this burnt algorithm pie. And clearly what we need to understand is what actually went on in terms of the requests made by the Department for Education. What did Ofqual say to the government? What did the government ask Ofqual? What did Nick Gibbs said in Parliament yesterday, that he had regular meetings with Ofqual? Did he raise our select committee report where we urged Ofqual to publish their standardisation model well in advance so that people could scrutinise it? Did the ministers ask about the appeals system? Because that was incredibly narrow. Originally, you could only appeal on the basis of bias and discrimination. So absolutely, we need to find out what went on the government side. We've got the Secretary of State coming before our committee yesterday. We had the debate in Parliament, but I am of the view there's just not one Quango at fault or one individual. I think there is in essence, it's a bit like a Ben-Hur movie. There's a cast of thousands who are involved in this, and really, what I think we need to do is learn the lessons, not just to finger wag at individuals or get the guillotine out, but to try and make sure that these kind of things never happen again. If I could just add one other thing, is that I'm slowly coming to the view, I haven't made up my mind completely on this, but the question is whether Ofqual is fit for purpose. Why do you need an independent? Why do you need an independent regulator? Double the costs. If during the saga they referred communications questions from the media and the public to the DfE, so is it independent or not?
But is the solution to that then to make sure that going forward, given that the chief regulator reports to Parliament, therefore to MPs, your committee indeed will have a role in appointing any permanent successor, isn't therefore potentially the solution to ensure that its independence is upheld in the future, that it is led in a way that...
why does it... So I just can challenge you. Why does it need to be independent? This idea that it's accountable to Parliament is a bit of a myth. Yes, they have to appear before my committee.
Yeah.
Yes, we would interview the new chief regulator, the chief exec, and the chair, and offer our opinion, but that can be ignored.
Yeah.
So we have a say, but it's not a final say.
Yeah.
How were they accountable to Parliament? We did a report. A series report saying that they should publish their models, saying that there would be over prediction and under prediction. We mentioned a lot of the evidence we'd had, which came to pass. They just put it on their shelf. They regarded MPs as annoying hobbits, in essence, from the shires. And they only responded about 10 days before the exam result with a tick box letter response. So tell me, are they really accountable to Parliament? I mean, we now know that the lines are blurred as to who is responsible for what. No one knows. This is the problem. When Ofqual took their stuff off their website on the 15th of August late at night, was that because they'd been ordered to by the DfE? Was it their own decision?
Sure. Well, that's where, as you say, the lack of transparency and opaqueness, and indeed just a lack of communications that key critical moments has not helped. But for those listening that have perhaps got a more kind of long-term historical lens on this, I mean, they will perhaps be listening to this and saying, well, didn't Ofqual anyway as an organisation come out of the ashes of previous sort of summer disasters, not quite on the scale of what's just happened this summer, and in obviously under different governments, but the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority got itself into hot water over an A-level sort of grading issue that actually resulted ultimately in a Secretary of State resigning, and arguably the government then sought to put kind of more blue water between the policy department and then the regulator, hence Ofqual was born, and then this whole idea of independent regulation. But for what you're saying, actually, in reality, those two, that distinction doesn't appear to exist, and therefore what you're saying is it probably would be better long term just to put it in the department, and ultimately then ministers will have to be accountable for any future problems that appear.
Well, I just asked the question is whether you need these giant quangos where people are paid this huge amount of money, the top management, and where they have 11 communications officers. They're advertising for another one for 80 grand a year. They're very top heavy. And whether or not these organisations are truly accountable. Yes, they have to appear before our committee, but at the end of the day, they didn't follow our recommendations except one, which was to agree to a helpline that they should have thought of anyway. So why do you? I'm not quite clear why you need an independent regulator for exams. I mean, at the end of the day, if it goes wrong, just as you pointed out in your previous question, you're saying, well, the governments are at fault. Well, if the governments are at fault, then why have an independent regulator in the first place? Okay. And I think I'm not entirely, I haven't entirely made my mind up about it, but I definitely think a debate needs to be had is whether the organisation should just be brought back into the DFE. So you don't, in essence, probably cut costs as well, but at least then you would know who was absolutely responsible and accountable, because ministers are accountable to Parliament for sure, who was in charge and who was making the decisions.
Okay, well, that's the kind of strategic choice and issue I'm sure that will come up in the upcoming FE white paper. And just finally, I just wanted to ask you, because I know you've got to go, is this week your committee had a round table around the FE white paper. Would you like to see government bring FE colleges into public ownership?
No, I wouldn't, actually. I don't think they need to be brought into public ownership. And most colleges, okay, there are problems, of course, around the country, but actually most colleges, I think, do an incredible job. And I'm a believer in autonomy. And at the moment you go back into public ownership, you would have all the constraints that inevitably brings with you. What I would like is more financial support for FE. For further education colleges. I'd like the government to treat FE as a number one priority, to rather than just have lots of new schemes all the time. Actually, to if they want institutes of technology, they should be FE institutes of technology, not separate institutes, for example, or national colleges. Just they should be linked to the best of FE. And I'd like the government to look properly at where FE leadership is most successful and try and replicate that around the country, because wherever I, as a former skills minister, wherever I visited FE college, it was down to the leadership and management team. If you can replicate that, you can get rid of a lot of the problems, even with financial resource issues. I'd like the Prime Minister to be regularly talking about further education. I'd love Radio 4, for example. There's a day programme rather than just have constant shows or talk about universities. I don't think Radio 4 even know that further education colleges exist, because they very rarely talk about them or go to them or talk about apprenticeships and skills. So I'm much less hung up about whether it's a public ownership.
Yeah. Well, I'm delighted.
Even though I would like the head of the AOC to actually come out and say what he really believes.
Yeah, I did see that exchange earlier, Robert. Well, rest assured, on Skills World Live, we'll always be talking about FE colleges, and it's a pleasure as always to talk to you. Robert Halfon, Chair of the Education Select Committee, thanks for coming on Skills World Live again.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Buick.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that 1980s classic, Van Halen and Jump. I was tempted at one point to start playing air guitar and here in my man cave studio. However, we must carry on with tonight's discussion about this summer's exams. I'm joined on the line by Ray Tooth, who's the CEO at Villiers Park, and Mark Lehane, who's director at the Campaign for Common Sense. Good evening to you both.
Hiya.
Hi. Thanks for joining the first show of the new series. Really appreciate it. Ray, let's start with you first. Do you agree with the Prime Minister Boris Johnson that all this summer's woes on A-levels and GCSEs can be put down to, and I quote, mutant algorithm?
No, not at all. I mean, the premise that an algorithm is able to mutate itself is an interesting one and lacks any real insight into how an algorithm is built. But it seems to me it wasn't just the outcomes of the algorithm that were problematic, but also the way that the process was communicated and the way that young people, their teachers and their families were listened to when they raised their very legitimate concerns.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, you're a former head teacher and I've been around the education policy landscape for quite some time. I mean, what's your thoughts on mutant algorithms, and would you have done anything differently this summer?
Oh, I think everyone would, with the benefit of hindsight, would want to do an awful lot of stuff differently if we had to go through it again. But I think it's like a lot of the things we've had to deal with during this pandemic, where we've tried to make decisions with the information we had at the time, and they've tried to make decisions which sort of work for the system overall or for the country overall. And then actually when you get down to the individual level, lots of people were disadvantaged in the end about that. So, the idea was to try and protect the standards and the proportion of grades that were given out this year to make them comparable to last year and potentially next year. And, there were absolutely issues in terms of kids getting massively downgraded and upgraded within that. But overall, that's what they were trying to do. The problem is when you do get down to the individual level, obviously we've not heard from all the kids that have done much better than they were expecting or better than they would have done in previous years. But there's those individual cases where it clearly wasn't fair, in the end have outweighed, I think probably rightly with hindsight, what they were trying to do at the national level. So, we've got this rule of six that's just kicking in, haven't we, about being able to get together now. Like, that really sucks on a personal level, but on a national level, it might be the right thing to do. And I think the exam system we tried to do this summer was one of those things, maybe right at the system level, but on the individual level just didn't work. Yeah, of course. And in fact, that rule of six, as we know, if you're going into team sports or into the workplace, then that rule of six doesn't necessarily apply, does it? So it's these outliers, it's these anomalies. And what I hear, in a way, you're sort of both saying is that, from the point of view of the furore this summer, phrase I keep on hearing is rock and a hard place. It's easy, as you're indicating there, Mark, in hindsight, to sort of criticise what went on. And I mean, Ofqual had over 20,000 responses to the detailed consultation they did once they got the mandate from ministers about the calculated grades. So they certainly did their homework and worked, with the sector, with education, with centres, with schools, with, of course, awarding bodies on trying to devise a system. But do you think in the end, the two sort of requirements of the ministerial mandates of, one, obviously trying to ensure students could progress, hence the role in the centre assessment, the tutor assessed grades, but at the same time, the almost kind of ministerial concern, the fear, the paranoia that this was going to lead to rampant grade inflation. I mean, it turns out, do you think, Ray, that those two things, those two objectives as part of the policy were just not compatible?
Well, I think to me it's interesting that those were the things that that government chose to focus on, when perhaps a more important concern was making sure that young people were ready to embark on whatever their next stage of learning or employment was. What we had in the end was a big focus on some poor communication and questionable decision making that led to not only that disruption in that first instance in terms of that shock of getting results that were unexpected and not understanding how to address that concern, but it's also, I think, had created this knock-on effect of apprehension as young people are stepping into the next phase of their life. So I'm not sure that they ever did need to make that particular binary choice. I think that there was a much broader context that they needed to be considering, which was how do we get young people out of a pandemic? How do we ready this generation for a global recession, the likes of which we possibly have never seen and hopefully will never see again? And how do we do that, giving everybody the best possible chance of success and agency in that journey?
Yeah, I mean, look, it'd be great to get both your views on this, but Mark, I mean, on this sort of dilemma, this binary choice between, is it progressing students and going with what the centre assessed grades said the performance of the pupil was, or do you try and put this national statistical moderation exercise in place to tackle grade inflation? I mean, actually, even when Ofqual published using the so-called mutant algorithm, there was still something like, I think, 2 or 3% grade inflation, depending on how you calculated it. We've now got effectively between 10 and 12% grade inflation on the GCSEs and A-levels. Where does that leave, though, future generations? Where does that leave, for example, my teenage son who's actually taking his GCSEs next year, if he takes the exams and his grades are not on a par with this summer's cohort? I mean, has grade inflation been permanently baked in, and is that the kind of political hit and the system hit we all have to take going forward? Or actually, could you see an even bigger problem next summer where there's a sense of injustice because that particular generation, also the COVID generation, who will feel that they're having to go back to a pre-COVID times in terms of the grade boundaries and distribution? I mean, Mark, what's your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think actually, having gone through this, people are smart, whether it is colleges, universities, employers, the kind of people that look at individuals' grades when they deal with them, they're going to be smart. They're going to see 2020 on their CV or their application form, and they're going to know that means it was a very different kind of year. I've got a very good friend actually who's got two of their children next year are going to be in year 11, or this year just started, are going to be in year 11 and year 13. Yeah. And actually it's the next batch of kids, the kids doing exams that I'm particularly worried about, because they have had a huge amount of disruption to the A-level, BTEC and GCSE courses, and we don't know what other disruption there may be between now and then. But I just think we will cope with it. I think people will get their head around it. Just as savvy employers know that, O-level grades going back 30 odd years were quite different in terms of standards to GCSE grades in the early days, and then GCSE grades before the Michael Gove reforms in recent times. I think the system will pick that up. And again, with hindsight, there are 7 main reasons why you assess an individual, to understand what they know, to know where they are in absolute terms, relative terms, their peer group, time to stands over time, and so on. Any single assessment, any set of qualifications can only fulfill a couple of those purposes really well. And maybe with hindsight, the priorities we tried to do this summer weren't the right ones. But of course, let's be clear, every nation in the United Kingdom adopted the same kind of approach, didn't they? So it wasn't just an English problem.
No, it's 4 nations approach, yeah, absolutely.
And actually, when you look at what other countries across, Europe and the wider world, they've all had similar questions to grapple with. And so, maybe with hindsight, I still haven't got a firm view on this. Maybe we should just accept it, just as we've pumped billions and billions of pounds into the economy. We've done quantitative easing to try and keep things going. Maybe with hindsight, grade inflation should have been a better option for us to have chosen up front this year.
Okay,
in the end, we've got that grade inflation, and we put everyone through a whole load of trauma and stress trying to get it sorted out.
Okay, so just like no one's saying in monetary terms we have to go back on the gold standard, or indeed the devaluations in the 1970s. You're saying it's a one-time hit then, Mark. I mean, Ray, how's that going to go down on students at Villiers Park?
Well, I'm not convinced that's true. When you look at the impact of disadvantage on young people who come from more disadvantaged backgrounds, actually, what you see is an accumulative effect on their overall outcomes. And we already see that in terms of whether or not they go to the best universities. We see it in terms of graduate destinations. We see it in terms of lifetime salaries. And so what might look to us right now as a single hit in terms of a change in the grade that they had expected in 2020 or a change in educational outcomes, actually what's more likely is to see that accumulative effect, because you might make an assumption about what a grade means to an individual because the pandemic was happening. What you don't understand on that individual's CV is whether they were living in a multi-occupancy house, whether they had access to online learning technology, whether they were also a young carer looking after a disabled parent. And those complexities get lost in, well, we saw them getting lost in the algorithm in terms of predicted outcomes for disadvantaged students, but they also get lost in the assumptions of these clever people who are looking at CVs and making decisions about people's life chances and opportunities.
Sure. Before we go to the break, from both of you, just give me one sort of thought, a sentence on what positive could actually come out of this summer. How could we actually deliver something for learners in future where we, where we do something different? Go on, Ray.
Oh, God, Mark, you were starting.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, he started to talk.
Yeah, no. So I think so. A really positive thing about this summer, and maybe I'm sort of putting a silver lining on it, was and particularly when I look at the school I used to run, Bedford Free School. I've been out there a few years, but the brilliant team that are running it now, they, in spite of everything, managed to ensure that every single pupil, because there's no sixth form at Bedford Free School, every single pupil, they've managed to secure them the right kind of place on the right kind of course or destination that they needed. They absolutely worked their tops off between like the initial results day and now. And I think, I know that's gone on across the system, teachers, families, pupils and others have really pulled their fingers out to get kids ultimately where they need to go, because GCSEs are a step, to the next stage. And I think that's something we can take a lot of heart from, which is even when things are going wrong or when you're in the middle of stuff, the system is still able to deliver for kids on the right kind of stuff.
Okay. Ray, final word to you then.
Well, I think really the final word needs to go to those young people who chose to raise their voice about this. I think it was hugely impressive and a real. I just stand in awe, really, of a generation of young people who decided to take on a government. Yeah. That takes real courage and shows absolutely the power of young people's voices and how articulate they are in this.
Okay, well, let's leave it on that positive note then, the power of young people's voices. I certainly hear my 15-year-old's voice louder than mine on many occasions. Mark Lehane.
I can literally hear my child's voice shouting for sausages.
I'm sure you can. Ray Tu, CEO at Villiers Park, and Mark Lehane, Director at Campaign for Common Sense. Thanks for joining Skills World Live this evening.
Thanks, Tom.
Want to know the future of apprenticeships in England? Then you can't afford to miss this showcase online conference, The Future of Apprenticeships, Delivering the Opportunity Guarantee. Coming up on the 5th of November, join ministers, employers and sector leaders in an interactive debate. Meet with other apprenticeship training providers, endpoint assessment organisations, tutors and apprentices as we recover from the pandemic together. Importantly, find out how the changes to apprenticeships will affect you. Book your ticket today. www.futureofapprenticeships.com. That's futureofapprenticeships.com.
Right, now in the closing segment of the show, so let's try and get more future focused, shall we? How do we stop an exams crisis like this ever happening again? And that's the next track, we'll turn that off. What does all this mean for the future of independent regulation? And how do we ensure that disadvantaged groups don't get the brunt of the pain this time next year? Joining us to discuss these questions and more, I'm sure, is David Price, OBE. He's an author, an educationalist. Good evening, David.
Yes, fine, Tom.
Thanks for joining us. And in this three-way segue, it's also, we're joined by Armajit Bazi, who's from the Black FE Leadership Group. Good evening to you, Armajit.
Good evening, Tom.
Thank you both again for joining us. Now, Armajit, let's start with you. What measures do you think government and Ofqual need to be taking now and in the future to try and avoid, hopefully, a crisis like this occurring again?
Well, the first thing is the spotlight, quite rightly, has been on the algorithm, but and the inherent bias that has been built into that. But equally, the spotlight has been on teacher assessment and the centre awarded grades and perceptions on that. But what if, especially against Ofqual's and the government's natural instinct to revert back to standardisation under the notion of reliability and validity, what if the teachers have got it right? What if the focus and the bias they've built into the system, which is majoring on personalisation and things like distance travelled, value added, motivation, potential, and yes, disadvantage, the criteria that they've built in is just much more personalised than the quest that the algorithm had been set on universal standardisation. So my agenda for the future is, if the government hasn't learned anything else, and it talks about £1 billion for catch-up support as a result of the loss of learning in COVID, it should have learned the major importance on personalisation in the context of curriculum content, in terms of assessment strategies, in the nature of qualifications, the access to support, after-school tuition, access to technology, and fundamentally a particular focus on everyone on high expectations across the system. That's my agenda.
I mean, you made a really interesting point there, I thought, Armajit, about, I think the phrase you used was perhaps the teachers got it right. And let's just unpack that for a moment. So, I mean, there's been a long-standing debate about whether examinations in whatever form are, frankly, the right thing for the 21st century. And interestingly, I suppose this summer has kind of exposed an interesting kind of debate around the notion of, well, is necessarily tutor-assessed grades a perfect system either? And then, of course, there's the algorithm itself, which was part, as you say, of the sort of standardisation to try and put a lid on grade inflation. Are you saying, because I want to put sort of words into your mouth, are you saying that actually we should perhaps only have a system where it comes down really to what the school, the tutors, the teachers think about an individual's performance? Did I interpret that right?
I believe in entrusting the professionalism of the workforce. I believe in robust standards. I really believe in high expectation. So any system for awarding qualifications which have national currency, I believe needs to be underpinned, Tom, by a robust moderation of assessment and awarding. And that can be done and has been demonstrated to have been done really successfully through moderation across centres. And I'm not talking about colleges to colleges and schools to schools, but cross-sectoral, standardisation. So I would strongly very much assert that is possible with an underpinning robust moderation.
Yeah, I think that's the key word there, moderation. And David, I mean, you're an expert on organisational learning and you've published widely on the subjects. I mean, given the insights then you have, and just thinking back to something there that Armajit was saying about, the teaching profession, trusting the profession, the organisations, albeit within a framework where I guess they can sort of moderate, self-regulate themselves, peer review. What thoughts do you have, as an author in this space, reflecting them back on the summer and what you've just heard?
Well, it's really great to hear Armajit make those connections, because as I was listening to your previous speakers, I was scribbling down that moderation isn't the problem. Who wouldn't want to see moderation? The problem, it seems to me, is standardization. And standardization, it seems to me, if you trace it back, has grown historically out of a lack of trust in the profession. And the reality is, this is not the first year that there's been a row about grades. And what we're seeing in this country is being mirrored in other countries. I do a lot of work in Australia, and they have their equivalent of A-levels is ATAR, and there's been an awful lot of people now saying we need to get rid of ATAR. The fact that we could sum up 12 years of a student's academic career in a single number, it's ridiculous, because the world doesn't work like this anymore. And I think the other point that none of the previous speakers made is that, as with any currency, it inflates over time. We've had concerns about the amount of first-class degrees that have been rising over years. Any currency will inflate. What hasn't been mentioned is the fact that progressively over the last 4 to 5 years, employers have stopped taking note of A-levels to the extent that they used to. So 40% of employers in 2014 were making those entry-level selections based on A-level grades, and that's now fallen to about 25%. So, you have to ask the bigger question, which is whether standardized testing is fit for the world after Corona, because I think Ray made some really valid points about what we're expecting our young people to do. And I think the discussion that needs to be had is standardized testing the best way of inculcating the kinds of skills they're going to need going forward?
Yeah, Armajit, I mean, you've co-founded the Black FE Leadership Group, and again, there's been challenges all along in the education system, not just around systemic racism, but also, the disadvantage gap and the systemic issues there. I mean, again, look, being future focused, how do we get something positive out of this and see some changes that, for example, will help assist with some of these very deep-rooted structural challenges?
As David so eloquently put it, the current system and the use of the algorithm isn't unique. It's long-standing, and it majors on favouring children from private schools, from grammars, small cohorts rather than large cohorts, and historical performance rather than recent improvements and even rankings. So my and the group's assertion is you really, really need to look at the report that has just come out, Tom, which will be of interest to you, from the Ofwat consultation on BTEC and other VQs. And deep down in that text, there is a theme developing from the feedback to that consultation, which is identifying that any forward system really needs to major on equity as important as standardization. And that's leveling the playing field for disadvantaged groups, looking at the content of the curriculum, which, by the way, Ofqual have ruled out, as well as the content of the assessment strategies, and whether that favours particular groups and disadvantages others. It's access to learning, access to technology, and access to extracurricular support. The NFER report that came out just recently, which identified that those learners, including BAME learners, about 4 months, lost 4 months of learning through the COVID situation. If you don't look at an overhaul at the qualification system based and predicated on equity, I think there's some really, really fundamental issues about the whole element of fairness.
Okay.
And that's something we really strongly feel about.
Yeah, and after every crisis in education, the one positive, I guess, is there's always an overhaul of some kind. I think the important thing is, and now obviously with your group, you can be in there around the table with others making those very eloquent points. David, last word to you then. Again, sort of reflections on some things Armajit said, as well as, frankly, if you were drafted in by Ofqual now to advise the interim leadership team on the sort of next steps, what sort of points would you be making to them?
Well, if I could just make 2 quick points. Amajit's right that equity has and this year more than any other year, it's become centre stage. And whatever system we get has to be more equitable than the current one that we've got. But I don't believe we can tinker with it anymore. And I advise a group in the US who are developing an alternative transcript for universities called the Mastery Transcript.
All right, okay, that's a good plug.
And one of its principles is no standardization. The other is no grades, because the reality is particularly the knowledge economy doesn't pay off on what you know. It pays off on what you can do with what you know. So if we're judged by performance in the real world, then it's a nonsense that we judge a student on a one-off timed examination and they get no second chances. And bear in mind, this was put together by a former Secretary of State for Education who had 6 bad days when he took his driving test, and finally Michael Gove managed to pass his test on the 7th attempt.
I thought you might be referring to Michael Gove. Absolutely.
We don't standardise driving tests. So why do we do that in education? Yeah.
Well, we certainly have a driving standard, but you're right. You can take that test as many times until you become competent to be let loose on the roads. Look, it's been a fascinating discussion. I could talk to you all night about this, but thanks again, Armajit Bazi from the Black FE Leadership Group, and you're just hearing there from David Price. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Buick.
Right. We're at the end of the show. Very, very nearly. I just wanted to say a few thanks, as ever, to the Skills World Live team for literally helping us get the show on the road. And in a few minutes' time, I think I should be on there right now, jumping on a virtual drinks call to raise a glass to our departing colleague, Emma Evans, who's been working at the Federation of Awarding Bodies for nearly 2 years now. So, Emma, this track's for you. You did indeed request it. So here you are, Tears for Fears. It's actually a live version. The old Shepherd's Bush BBC studios. It's called Head Over Heels. See you soon.
You
Remember to subscribe to Skills World Live at fenews.co.uk or just download the show from any one of your favourite podcasting sites, including iTunes, Spotify and Spreaker. Your world, Skills World.